Chapter 29. Just when I thought I knew every old wives' tale to ever come out of Norway, I had a premonition. Now, you're not going to believe this, but try. I was in a huge library searching the shelves. I discovered there were no letters from A to M. I was lifted up to the level of the chandelier and dropped down at the other end. Again, I searched the shelves. There were no letters from X to O. Suddenly, I realized there was only one letter, the letter. I began to recite the alphabet to make sure, and just as I was approaching M, the chandelier began to swing violently, and a librarian began showering me with books. You'll need a Norwegian grammar, a Norwegian dictionary, a Norwegian reader, and some Norwegian maps. I laughed it off, but what I truly should have done was dedicate myself to the exercises Dorothy had recommended to build up muscle reserve. I should have also resumed the Red Cross nursing course I had started that fall, but abandoned after just one lesson when Eric came down with the Asian flu. And most importantly, I should have sought advice from immigration experts on navigating the challenges of merging divergent cultures in such overcrowded conditions. It was that winter when Freya, 14, was in her second year at Milwaukee High School, 10 miles away. Sig was in the 8th grade at Happy Valley Elementary. Eric had graduated into the 1st grade from a private kindergarten where he had received high marks. Pay attention to that, Mrs. Chappell. We were at the jumping tournament at the Cascade Jumping Hill, where Corey was tournament chairman and judge, and I was hill stomper and general helpmate. The only mishap had been a fall by a skier, announced as a Canadian. He had to be taken off the hill in a toboggan, not too unusual for a jumping tournament. The next day, however, Corey received a call from the ski club doctor whom Corey had known from the time, years before, when he broke his leg cranking his car. From that encounter, Dr. Carlson had become a member of the ski club. His report was startling. The jumper was in serious condition, had a badly shattered leg which would require several operations, and a body cast for 6 months. To complicate matters, the other Canadian skiers had returned home on the afternoon of the tournament, leaving the responsibilities for the injured skier in the ski club's hands. They said they knew little about him beyond his name, Olav Hove Danok, that he was Norwegian, that he had appeared at their jumping hill one day, speaking very little English, that they had helped him find housing, and that he had hitched a ride with them to our tournament. Corey and I went to the hospital. The skier spoke very little English, and his Norwegian was difficult for Corey to understand. Corey explained, "We speak different dialects." Through their attempts to communicate, Corey learned that Olav was from the western countryside of Norway. He had come to Canada that summer, worked in the north, and came to Vancouver for the winter. As could be expected, Olav had very little money and no insurance. The big concern of the ski club officials was the financial responsibility. "We don't have another $1 million, they warned. They were referring to a lawsuit that had been brought against 3 jumping judges. Do you find it hard to believe that Corey was one of them? By a young Seattle skier who had fallen in a Leavenworth, Washington tournament and had suffered a debilitating injury. His contention was that the wind had been gusty and the judges should have stopped the tournament. The case had dragged on for several years while we struggled with the problem of how to raise $350,000. At the meeting, Trustee Vern Caldwell assumed the responsibility of negotiating with the hospital. Corey offered to continue to visit him because Vern spoke no Norwegian. Since it would be a long time before he could travel back to Canada, the question remaining was, who would care for Olav after his release from the hospital? "We'd better pray for some heroic individual who has plenty of time," Vern suggested. I was surprised by the remark. Prayer was not often called for in the ski club. In the days following, Corey went often to the hospital and brought home reports about the skier's condition, and I followed Vern's admonition to pray. The more I prayed, the more I had to stifle a feeling that is expressed so well in an old hymn, "Rescue the perishing, care for the dying." I was familiar with the feeling. On numerous occasions, I had answered this urge to jump in and give assistance. Door's 2 children during World War II, friends' children for days, weeks, months, and Billy Sue, who became our first foster daughter after one of our church friends had been unable to handle her, and the incident which had almost cost me my life. I had been a counselor at a children's camp at Cannon Beach Conference Grounds. The week had been an enriching experience, but overly demanding. I was not fully recovered from the car accident 6 months before that had injured my back and brought on early labor and Eric's birth. On our last day, Other counselors and I had herded our group of active youngsters, including Freya and Sig, for a hike along several miles of ocean shoreline. When we reached Haystack Rock, we paused to rest. I lay down amongst the driftwood, realizing how weary I was, and anxious to return home to baby Eric, whom I had left in the care of Corey's sister Svea. Lulled by the sound of the waves, my mind drifted back to the words of a missionary to China, who had addressed the children that morning. Often as I look at the poor natives, my common sense tells me that I am wasting my life taking them the gospel. Then I realized this is the life that God prepared me for, my calling. I wondered, what had God prepared me for? Suddenly a cold chill shocked me into awareness. I jumped up, scanning my surroundings. Everything seemed normal. The other counselors were watching the children playing close by. Groups of people enjoying the sun dotted the landscape. Then I glanced out into the surf. Beyond the breakers, barely visible, were several bobbing heads. Alarmed, I dashed off across the dry sand. At the water's edge, I paused to catch my breath and observe the situation. I spotted 3 young men standing waist-high in the waves. I kicked off my sandals, pulled off my jacket, then bolted out to them. One stammered, "My brother got washed out." We tried to help, but... My first impulse was to dive in, but I was brought up short. If healthy young men were afraid to venture into the surf, who was I? An out-of-shape 35-year-old mother of 3 who, despite my early training in life-saving, had not swum a stroke in 3 years. I was hesitant, but then, from deep within my being, I heard the word go. I turned to the boys. "Get a boat, get people to form a chain." I dove into the cold water and began swimming. It seemed strange that I was not overcome with fear. To swim beyond the breakers is utterly foolhardy, an invitation to disaster. My father had cautioned against it repeatedly, and through all the years I had never done anything so foolish. With each breath I gulped in salt water. My wet, straggly hair blinded my eyes. I had to change my stroke often. Finally I was out in the large swells. I paused, treading water. Already I was exhausted. Pain ran from my spine throughout my whole body. Suddenly I realized that my heavy pedal pushers were pulling me down. I grabbed the tab of the zipper only to realize that I had used a large safety pin to secure the lock. Again, I was assailed with uncertainty. But on the next large swell, 2 floundering swimmers, a young man and a girl, were dropped almost literally into my lap. My life-saving skills became clear. A few strokes brought me to the young man making his last feeble efforts to stay afloat. His appearance shocked me. His pupils had rolled under his lids. His deathly color made me realize that he was unconscious. I reached out and turned his head. Then my attention was drawn to the girl, perhaps 15, who was hysterically battling the waves. Obviously, she was no swimmer. I wondered how she had survived this long. Had the man kept her afloat until he had given out? I angled the man between us, knowing that if I allowed her to grab me, she could lock me in a stranglehold that I might not have the strength to break. Then, treading water, and with as little energy as possible, I struggled to keep us afloat. Until now I had been too occupied to look back. However, as my need grew more desperate, I turned. The sight filled me with terror. There was no shoreline, only the breakers. I became disoriented. How long had I been here? It seemed like an eternity. Where were we? I recalled feeling the undertow when I ran out. That meant the current was heading for the open sea, and we were being carried with it. I had expected help, but now I realized I didn't even know what kind of help might be available. I had never been to Cannon Beach before. The reasoning that I had closed my ears to before crashed into my brain. My children, my husband, my life. I can't save these people, I have to save myself. I took my hand from under the man's head, watching the water lapping around his reddish hair. He rolled onto his face and began to disappear. The girl, desperate to save herself, caught his arm and scrambled to climb on top of him. I was stung by the thought. Without help, they will die. But what has that to do with me? I can't do it, Lord. I don't have the strength. I can't even save myself. I tried to turn away, but strangely I couldn't. My thoughts suddenly became clear. It was as if my mind had been hung on some distant cloud. I turned back, dove under the water, and brought the man to the surface. I tried to pull him by his hair, but it was too short. I grabbed his shoulders, but they were too slippery. Finally, I took him into a cross-chest carry, certainly not the easiest method in turbulence, but it was the only carry possible. I got him straightened out and demanded of the girl, grab his arm and hang on. She became strangely calm and complied. Strength came in pulses, just enough for the present stroke. Left arm forward. Pull back. Kick. Left arm forward. I couldn't keep my lungs filled with air. Each desperate gulp was answered with a mouthful of salty water. I was a wild animal caught in a trap, having to drag my destruction behind me. Pull back. Kick. Then a new terror confronted me. The girl lost her hold and sank from sight. I must change my course. I must abandon the man, dive for the girl, and struggle on. But unbelievably, the girl popped into sight again. She was sputtering water, but her words were like honey from a rock. I can touch! With that, she bounded to shore and disappeared. I turned toward the shore, and there was the beach lined with spectators, standing, watching. Oh God, I tried to scream, but I was too weak. We were still in a terrible plight. I was fighting the undertow, and an awful blackness kept threatening to envelop me. Finally, a man ran out, took my awful burden, and threw him over his shoulders. And I was left to sink down into the water. I watched the lifeguards arrive with ropes and buoys. I watched as they pulled out several other victims, and the lifeless form of one girl.